Thank you very much for all coming out tonight, and I would particularly like to thank Art Centre for hosting this show and Stephen Nolan for having the vision to invite us to do this and to put the resources of his gallery to work on this project. I'm not sure how many of you have been involved in an art installation, but we had a team of people for 3 weeks building much of this on site. Most of it has to actually be grown in place, and it does take vision on behalf of a gallery director to give artists that kind of time and space and resources to do. I'd also, before I begin my formal talk, very much like to thank two very special people, Anna Meyer and Jemima Wyman, who are the assistant curators on this exhibition with Christine and I. They've been far more than just assistants. They too have had vision and strength and power. And between the four of us, Christine and I and Anna and Jemima, I think we're a little unit that embodies the greater power and message of this project, which is that when people do things together, collectively, we can do far more than any of us can achieve as individuals. Everything that you've seen in the gallery is the work of hundreds of people. And in a sense, this project is like coral reefs themselves. Reefs are colonial organisms, and they build themselves. Millions and billions of polyps together build something like the Great Barrier Reef. And that is what this project, I think, embodies more than anything. Jerry Schubel has just given us a marvellous talk about the environmental issues that underlie this project. I was thrilled to see him raise all of the issues that this project is responding to, ocean acidification and global warming specifically. So I won't repeat what Jerry has told us, but I hope I will from time to time refer to it simply to remind us all that this isn't just about art. In fact, it is primarily about change. This is a project which was conceived out of a desire to bring about change in each and every one of our lives, including Christine and my own life. Stephen has asked me to give a talk about the history of the project and the other issues underlying it, aside from the ecological issues. So I'm going to try to make this relatively brief so we can all get back to enjoy the work over a glass of wine. And we can continue the discussion then. So the project is called Hyperbolic, or this exhibition specifically is called Hyperbolic, Reefs, Rubbish and Reason. And every one of those three words is as meaningful as any other, and they are all entwined. So I will begin by spending a few minutes talking about reefs. Then I will actually flip the order here and talk about the reason behind the project. And then we will end on rubbish, the most important element where we hope you all will actually think about changing your behaviour today. So what we're doing is crocheting a coral reef. And as you can see in the gallery, we've crocheted a lot of a coral reef. Christine and I grew up in Queensland, Australia, which is the state which is home to the Great Barrier Reef. And ever since our childhood, reefs have been under threat. When we were growing up, occasionally these things called coral bleaching events would happen. Large sections of the reef would turn white. Nobody knew why that happened. It was clear that it was due to environmental pressures, but nobody really knew what caused it. Bleaching events are increasing rapidly. They used to occur about once every decade. Now they're occurring in the Great Barrier Reef in large sections every few years. And the main reason that bleaching is now known to be happening, apart from the usual culprits like toxic waste dumping, sewage runoff, agricultural runoff, etc., the main reason that bleaching is occurring now is because of rising seawater temperatures. Coral bleaching is proof that global warming is not in the future, it's here and it's happening now. So Chrissy and I we decided that we wanted to crochet a coral reef to do something beautiful, to do it collectively with some other people, and also to basically try to call some attention to the plight of reefs all over the world. Here you see a photo of a part of what we call our bleached reef. You've seen, those of you who've been in the gallery already will have seen that one of the largest sections of it is all white. So this was our crochet invocation of coral bleaching. So we began the project actually in 2000 and the very end of 2005. So we've been doing it for almost 6 years. And when we first started the project, we had the vision that we would do it as a collective thing. And we thought there might be a few other people who would like to join us in this project. We had no idea that it would open a floodgate. Honestly, we thought that there would perhaps be 20 or 30 people who might, idiosyncratically be interested in this fusion of environmentalism and handicraft, and as you'll see in a minute, mathematics. And we thought we'd do a little bit of a reef. But it turns out that now there are basically 5,000 people around the world who've contributed to various incarnations of this show, and I'll get into that in a little while. But we really did not expect ourselves to be 6 years later crocheting coral. We thought we'd do this for, a month or two, and we'd have a little table-size installation, and maybe one day it'd go into a gallery. We believe that it's probably now it is certainly the biggest participatory art science project in the world, and it's become actually one of the biggest participatory art projects in the world. Here's some pictures of our early tabletop work. The project has actually been through various, as it were, aesthetic phases. There's a sort of weird way in which we have recapitulated the history of art with this project. We started out doing very representational things. This was what we sort of think of as our Dutch landscape phase. They were very formal and composed works. And, I come from a science background. I'm a science writer by profession, and Christine comes from an art background. She teaches at Cal Arts, and she used to be a painter. And so we both sort of are interested in formalism. And, I was coming from a sort of more natural history type background, was very interested in the naturalism. So we started out, as it were, like, modern Western art, being very interested in really representing coral reefs. And you can see from these pictures that they really do look like reefs. Then we sort of began to branch out to a bit more sort of conceptualising, where we got, this was an early version of the bleached reef. And you can begin to see that it's getting more and more, as it were, fantastical. I mean, sometimes people look at these pictures and they say, oh my gosh, I walked into the gallery and the first thing I thought was it really was a coral reef. Now, anyone who's actually been diving knows that reefs don't really look like this. It is, as Chrissy likes to put it, it's not a documentary. But what is interesting, but what's interesting is that these frilly crenellated structures that you're seeing, they are so emblematic of reefs that it almost doesn't matter what you do. As long as you use these frilly crenellated forms, it evokes in your mind a reef, because these structures are actually what coral reefs do so powerfully and intensively. This was a very early version of our plastic reef. This is what we call our toxic reef. And you can see it's got a very junky look to it, but this is a hybrid of plastic and yarn. But again, even though these materials and colours are completely unnatural, it still manages to actually evoke in your mind the idea of a coral reef. So there's a very strange way in which in this project aesthetics has been a huge part of it, but we're kind of given a boost here because the form, literally, it doesn't sort of matter what you do with it, as I said, it tends to look like, evoke a coral reef. Now, the project began with Christine and I literally sitting in our living room crocheting these forms, and it was Christine who had the idea at the end of 2005 that we could crochet a coral reef. And Chrissy put this out there, in our living room one day while we were sitting there crocheting away and watching episodes of Xena Warrior Princess. And a lot of this project has been done while we're watching, as it were, second-rate television. I should say second-rate lovingly, because we spend a lot of time watching things like this. Anyway, Chrissy put it out there in the conditional tense, we could crochet a coral reef. And I put a little announcement on the Institute for Figuring's website saying, is there anyone out there who'd like to join us in this project? And practically the first person who called was the Andy Warhol Museum. And they said, we're having a show in a year's time about artists' response to global warming. We'd like your coral reef in it. And I kind of laughed and said, well, we've only just started, it's going to take a long time, but we'll do a bit for you. So this is actually a picture of our very first installation from the Andy Warhol Museum. And at that point, it really was like 2 or 3 tabletops worth. It was small and delicate, and people loved it. And then we got invited to do it at the Chicago Cultural Center as part of the Chicago Humanities Festival, whose theme that year, which was 2007, was global warming. And they said to us, we've got a 3,000 square foot gallery. We'd like you to fill it with corals. And I was a science writer, and I didn't know anything about what it meant to fill a 3,000 square foot gallery. So I kind of laughed and said, oh yes, okay, fine. And I came back home and told this to Christine, and she basically said, you're off your head. We can't. And she had 2 choices at this point. She could have either said, you're on your own, off you go, darling, or she could do what she did do, which is basically pick up a crochet hook and get to work. And I should say there have been many people who have contributed to the project, but Chrissy has single-handedly crocheted as much as everybody else put together, and that's on top of having a full-time job teaching at Cal Arts. So to cut a long story short, at the end of 2007, we did in fact fill a 3,000 square foot gallery in Chicago. It wasn't quite as packed as it could have been, but the show was huge. And this is a picture of it, and you can see that there's a huge amount of crochet there. But one of the reasons that we were able to fill that gallery is because we decided in conjunction with the people there that we should also have the local people of Chicago crochet a coral reef as well. So as well as the people who were working directly with Christine and I, we taught workshops in Chicago, and then the people who we taught went all over Chicago to cultural centres and schools, community centres and yarn stores, etc. And the people of Chicago collectively made a Chicago reef. So what happened was that the project became, as it were, a kind of viral project. And since Chicago, we've done this community aspect of it in New York, London, Arizona, Dublin, and most recently at the Smithsonian, where the reef was showing until about a month ago at the National Museum of Natural History in the Sand Hall of Ocean Science. It's the first time that the Smithsonian Natural History Museum have ever showed an art project. And the reason they wanted to do it is because of the interconnection here of environmentalism with art and also, as Jerry so beautifully pointed out, the participatory collective nature of it. The project does owe its strength and power to its collectivity and to the fact that now there are, in every city that we do this, hundreds and hundreds of people participate. And as I said earlier, all over the world now, we know that over 5,000 people have contributed to one of the community reefs. We haven't done a community reef per se in Los Angeles because this is our hometown, and we sort of consider that the whole reef project is, as it were, an LA project. But there have been a group of women here in Pasadena, led by Janice Ogata, who have contributed to the project, and their work has been incorporated into the various reefs, and we'd like to thank Janice for spearheading the local effort here. This is a picture of the part of what we had when we did the show in Scottsdale, and I want to point out that this is an aerial view, obviously, of just part of what constitutes the work of the New York Reef and the Chicago Reef. So since then, so this is just two of the local reefs and part of it. There have now been, I think, something like 25 community reef projects done around the world, so that not just when we do these shows, but the project has, as it were, truly gone viral, where people in communities from Cape Town to Sydney to Melbourne, Perth, all over Latvia, there are one being done now in Germany and Poland, all over the world, the reef is beginning to crop up and local communities are crocheting their own reef. So in that sense, the project is replicating the process of what happens with real coral reefs. One of the ways in which real coral reefs propagate themselves is that the corals send out spawn like pollen, and the little spawns go out and settle down in the ocean elsewhere, and new reefs begin to grow. And so this project is like that. It's truly viral. It's truly, as it were, growing organically. And just as a head of coral is itself a collective project, because each head of coral is made up from thousands of individual coral polyps, which are actually, each one is a separate animal, but when they join in a head of coral, they actually develop a network of effectively circulatory system. So these collective organisms become like a single organism, which collectively feed, collectively breathe, and collectively share their nutrients. And this is what we see as a metaphor, that the reef mimics, the crochet reef mimics living reefs in this sense, but it is also a metaphor for, I think, as it were, I would like to say, the sublimation of the individual ego in the service of a much greater project, which is basically making something not only beautiful, but something that is actually living and breathing and organically sharing. I think that Dr. Schubel's talk was absolutely critical. We are all here on planet Earth, in it together. None of us can leave, except those 12 people who have been sent to the moon. But even they came back. Like Jerry, I believe we've been paying a lot more attention to outer space, and that we need to be paying more attention to, as it were, the inner space of Earth and the inner space of the oceans. I'm going over my time, so I'm just going to be very brief here. The question of reason comes up. What is the reason behind crocheting a coral? If you wanted to mimic a coral reef, there are many, perhaps, potentially, methodologies one could use. But crochet, it turns out, is the logically necessary medium, because all of these frilly crenellated structures that you see are embodiments of a kind of geometry called hyperbolic geometry, which is actually the geometry that coral reefs, the organisms mimic, or embody. And it turns out that although nature has been making these forms for 500 million years, human mathematicians did not believe that such structures were possible until the 19th century, when this hyperbolic geometry was discovered. And mathematicians were astounded and at first thought that nothing like this ought to be able to exist. And they didn't actually realize that it was literally sitting there in front of them in the ocean every day. Hyperbolic geometry is an alternative to the two kinds of geometries you already know about, which is Euclidean geometry, the geometry of a flat plane, and spherical geometry, which exists on the surface of the Earth and which is therefore important in our understanding of navigation. And it turns out that, as I said, there is a third kind of geometry, and the only way that we know, or the best way we know how to make models of it, is with crochet. That was a discovery that was made by Dr. Dana Taimina, a mathematician at Cornell University. She only made that discovery in 1997. And mathematicians before that didn't know how to make models of this structure. The three kinds of geometries are all, as it were, represent different mathematical possibilities for the structure of space. I don't have time to go into it at much length, but just let me say very briefly that one way of understanding the difference between them is by the tessellations you can do on the surface. And you'll see this represented in the far room of the exhibition. On a flat plane, you can cover a surface or tessellate a surface with hexagons, which is basically the structure that we see in beeswax. On the surface of a sphere, what happens is, we've all seen a soccer ball. Basically, you take away some of the hexagons and replace them with pentagons, which have 5 sides. So by literally removing one side every now and again, it causes the structure to pull in on itself and become what we call a positive curvature space. You've got actually, as it were, this space that wants to pull towards itself. This is also the structure of geodesic domes. So to make a hyperbolic space, you do the opposite move. Instead of replacing some of the hexagons with 5-sided pentagons, you replace them with 7-sided heptagons, and that has the opposite effect. And so what you get is, instead of having a positive curvature space that curves towards itself, you have a negative curvature space that curves away from itself. And for any of you who are interested in doing this for yourself, you'll see in the back room of the exhibition large-scale models of this, and you can cut and paste with sticky tape and scissors your own version, and we have cutouts there for you to sit and play with if you would like to make a negative curvature space yourself. As I said, the best way to do these, by far the easiest way, is with crochet. It's a lot of work to do these cutting and paper folding ones, and they're very hard to work with. Crochet is by far the best methodology, and it turns out that on these crochet surfaces, you can actually stitch the mathematical theorems. And Dr. Taymina and her husband David Henderson actually use these models in teaching non-Euclidean geometry to their students at Cornell. The introduction of this non-Euclidean geometry with hyperbolic space actually opened up the whole field of what we now call non-Euclidean geometry, which leads to a new form of mathematics, and it is the mathematics that ultimately underlies general relativity. So there is, in fact, more to this than just pretty forms. This revolution in understanding new structures ultimately will lead us to working out what is the structure of our universe. But as I said, sea slugs have been knowing this about this geometry for hundreds of millions of years. And I sometimes say that the purpose of my talk, or the purpose of this project, is to bring us all up to the level of understanding of a sea slug. Nature has in fact been making hyperbolic structures since the Silurian age, and here is some pictures of actual hyperbolic corals. There is a whole taxonomy of hyperbolic forms in the ocean, and so too there is a whole taxonomy of hyperbolic crochet organisms. When Chrissy and I began the project, we didn't realise that there would be so much, as it were, fecundity. We thought that there was a few basic structures and that we would exhaust the possibilities very quickly. But our contributors, the remarkable women who have joined us in this project, have themselves developed whole new, as it were, branches of the crochet tree of life. And this project, in that sense, also mirrors the evolution of life on Earth. Just as life on Earth begins with simple single-celled organisms, with all of which are encoded by DNA, and then from the simple structures we branch out to ever more complex forms so that we end up today with giraffes and peacocks. So too, the Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef project starts out with a very simple formula, a very simple pattern that we could teach any of you in half an hour. But once you start playing with the DNA, once you start branching out from the simple crochet formula and do embellishments, you can develop ever more complex creatures. And as I said, we now know there is a never-ending crochet tree of life. The ocean is a beautiful and rich environment, and as Dr. Schubel told us, it is dying. Carbon dioxide is one of the main reasons it is dying, But there is one final aspect of this project that I will end on, and that is the fact that as well as our profligate use of CO2, we also have the problem of the profligate use of plastic. Plastic is a petroleum byproduct. It too is coming from oil. So we end with rubbish. The ocean is being inundated with a tsunami of rubbish. Our plastic rubbish, your plastic rubbish, my plastic rubbish. This rubbish is accumulating in these great vortexes in the ocean, the biggest one of which is called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is now twice the size of Texas and 30 meters deep. When Chrissy and I heard about that, we decided that we ought to become aware of our plastic usage. So we started to keep our own plastic trash, and we've kept 4 years' worth of it building up in our garage. This trash heap here, some people think it's ugly, but if you think it's ugly, this is what the future is containing. And so the project essentially is saying the beauty of all those classic yarn-based reefs that you've seen, the beauty of the pictures that Jerry Schubel showed us, they are in danger of being gone by the end of the century. And in its place, if we're not careful, what we will have is great floating islands of plastic trash. We hope that every one of you will think about your own use, not only of fossil fuels, but also about plastic and what you can do every day to reduce it. I think I'll end there, and thank you all very much for coming.